Come inside before this storm buries you. Those 7 words spoken by a 74-year-old janitor to a dying Hells Angels road captain bleeding behind a dumpster in the middle of a Cleveland rainstorm started a chain reaction that nobody in this city was prepared for. Not the tenants, not the police, not the mayor, and certainly not the 1,800 motorcycle riders who would one day line that street in total silence, helmets off, heads bowed for a forgotten old man that the world had decided no longer mattered. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this old man's story has traveled. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Harold Bennett had not been afraid of anything in a very long time. Not because he was brave in some Hollywood way, not because he'd trained for danger or spent years hardening himself against the world. No. Harold had simply outlived most of the things that used to frighten him. He'd outlived his fears the same way he'd outlived his youth, his career, his marriage, and eventually the version of himself he'd once been proud of. When you've already lost the things that mattered most, the things that are supposed to scare ordinary people just stop working. That's what 74 years will do to a man. Harold was a night janitor at Riverside Towers, a 12-story apartment building in one of Cleveland's older industrial neighborhoods, the kind of neighborhood that had once smelled like steel and ambition, and now mostly smelled like exhaust and old cooking grease. He had worked there for 11 years. Before that, he had spent 31 years as a steelworker at the Cuyahoga Valley plant, back when that plant was the heartbeat of the entire district. Back when Harold Bennett had been somebody. Now he was the man who mopped the floors after midnight. He lived in the basement, a single room behind the boiler room that the building's original manager had let him use as part of his compensation package. It wasn't much. A cot, a hot plate, a small television that got 3 channels reliably, and 2 more if the weather cooperated. A radio that sat on the edge of the sink, playing old country stations, until Harold fell asleep, and playing them again when he woke up. He had made it as comfortable as he could. There were photographs on the wall. A wedding picture from 1974, him and Dorothy young and laughing in front of a church in Akron. Her hair dark and curled, his face still unlined. A photo of his son Marcus at age 7 holding up a fish at a lake in Pennsylvania, both of them grinning like idiots. A postcard from Niagara Falls that Dorothy had bought on their 25th anniversary and never gotten around to mailing. She passed in 2016. Marcus stopped calling in 2019. Harold didn't talk about either of those facts with anyone because there was nobody to tell them to. That was the quiet truth of his life. Every evening at 10 o'clock, he put on his gray work uniform, the one with the small Riverside Towers logo stitched above the pocket, and he began his rounds. Lobby first. Then the elevator corridors. Then the stairwells. Then the laundry room on the 2nd floor. Then back down for any emergency calls, a burst pipe on 4, a locked-out tenant on 7, a broken hallway bulb on 9. Most nights nobody spoke to him. Not rudely, not intentionally. It was simply that Harold existed in the building the way the plumbing did quietly underground, expected to function without needing to be noticed. Tenants walked past him with their eyes on their phones. Young mothers pushed strollers around his mop bucket without looking up. The building manager, a 40-year-old man named Dennis Pratt, spoke to Harold only when something was broken. And even then, it was never a conversation, just a complaint delivered over the phone in a flat, impatient tone, as if Harold were an appliance that had malfunctioned. "The heat's out on 6 again, Harold. Fix it tonight." "Someone clogged the drain in 3B again, Harold, before morning." "And Harold, don't forget the dumpster alley on your rounds. Management wants it clean." Yes, the dumpster alley. Harold cleaned it every Tuesday and Friday without fail. It ran along the east side of the building, a narrow corridor between the tower and the concrete wall of the neighboring parking structure. Nobody used it except building staff and the occasional raccoon. Harold had swept it so many times, he could have done it blind. He knew every crack in that alley. He knew the sound of the rain on the dumpster lids. He knew the way the wind curled through that narrow passage in November and hit you like a wall if you weren't expecting it. On the night of November 14th, Harold was on his second sweep of the alley just after 1 in the morning when he heard it. Not the rain, not the wind. Something else. A sound caught between a groan and a cough, wet and heavy, coming from behind the far dumpster at the end of the corridor. Harold stopped walking. He stood very still for a moment, mop handle in both hands, listening. There it was again. Most people, and Harold understood this about most people, would have kept moving. Would have told themselves it was a stray animal, or the wind doing something strange, or a problem that belonged to someone else. Most people had developed a very refined skill for not hearing the things they didn't want to deal with. Harold had never been good at that particular skill. He walked toward the sound. He came around the side of the dumpster and stopped. A man was lying there against the concrete wall, half-slumped, legs extended in front of him like he'd simply sat down and couldn't get back up. He was enormous, well over 6 feet broad across the shoulders, the kind of physical size that made Harold think of the men he'd worked alongside in the plant back in the 70s. His black leather jacket was soaked through. His jeans were caked with mud, and something darker along the left thigh. His face was tilted slightly upward toward the rain. His eyes were open, but barely focused. Harold crouched down to his level. Up close, he could feel the heat radiating off the man, even through the cold air. He was burning. Fever. Real fever. The kind that comes from something gone wrong inside. The man's eyes found Harold's face. His voice came out barely above a whisper. "Don't call anyone." Harold looked at him for a long moment. "How long have you been out here?" The man's jaw tightened, like answering was something he had to fight for. "Few hours, maybe more." "You hurt?" "I'll be fine." Harold looked at the man's left leg, the dark stain on the denim. "That doesn't look like fine." The man moved, tried to push himself upright against the wall, and the sound he made doing it was not the sound of a man who was fine. It was the sound of a man who was running on the very last of whatever he had left. Harold put a hand on his shoulder, not forcefully, just firmly. "Stop. You stop right there." The man froze. Harold said, "I'm not calling anyone. I'm just going to help you stand up. Then you're going to come inside with me and get warm before this storm finishes what it started. You understand?" The big man stared at him. "You don't know who I am." "I don't care who you are," Harold said. "I care that you're going to die in this alley if you stay here another hour. Now, are you going to let me help you stand up or not?" A long silence. The rain hammered the dumpster lid above them. Then slowly, the man gave a single nod. Oh, getting him upright was not easy. Harold was 5'9" and 160 pounds on a good week. The man leaning against him was built like a monument. But Harold had spent his entire working life moving things that were heavier than they should have been, and he had a way of using leverage and patience that younger men tended to underestimate. He got him on his feet. They moved slowly through the alley, Harold bearing most of the weight on his right shoulder, the man's left arm across his back. Harold could feel the fever through the leather jacket. He could feel the man's breathing labored too fast with a catch in it that he didn't like. They came in through the basement service entrance. Harold held his key badge to the reader and pushed the door open with his back, guiding the man through without letting him hit the frame. The hallway inside was narrow and lit by a single overhead bulb. "Left," Harold said quietly. "My room's at the end." The man said nothing. Harold got him through the door, moved the single wooden chair from the corner so he could lower the man onto the edge of the cot, and then stood back and caught his own breath. For the first time in full light, he could see the man clearly. The Hells Angels patch on the back of the jacket. The road captain insignia. The name stitched in worn thread beneath the Death's Head logo. Reaper. Harold looked at it for a moment. Then he turned to the hot plate, filled a pot from the sink, and started heating water. "I'm Harold," he said without turning around. A pause from behind him. "Vince? You hungry, Vince?" "No." "That's too bad because I'm making soup anyway." Vince Malone was 51 years old and had spent the better part of 30 of those years making sure people were afraid of him. Not that Harold knew any of this yet. He would learn it piece by piece over the following days, The way you learn anything real about a person, not all at once, not in a single clean explanation, but in fragments offered reluctantly in the small hours of the night when exhaustion breaks down the walls people build around themselves. What Harold knew in that first hour was this: the man was sick, he was hurt, he didn't want anyone to know he was here, and he had absolutely no idea what to do with someone who was kind to him without wanting something back. Harold cleaned the wound on his leg, a deep laceration, already showing early signs of infection, the kind that needed a doctor, but would have to make do with hydrogen peroxide and gauze from the first aid kit Harold kept under the sink. He worked in silence efficiently, the way he'd learned to handle most things. Vince watched him work with an expression Harold couldn't quite read. "You're not going to ask me what happened," Vince said. It wasn't a question. "Nope," Harold said. "Why not?" Harold glanced up at him briefly. "Because it's not my business. Hold still." Vince went quiet again. When the soup was ready, instant chicken noodle, the store brand, the only kind Harold kept. Harold handed him a mug of it and sat down in the chair across from him. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the small machine on the counter. Outside, the rain was still hitting hard, drumming against the small ground-level window near the ceiling. Vince held the mug with both hands. He stared down into it. "You live here," he said finally. "In the basement. Been here 11 years. And you're okay with that?" Harold shrugged. "It's warm. It's mine. That's more than a lot of people have." Vince took a slow drink of the soup. His hands were still trembling slightly, the fever working through him. "That jacket," Harold said carefully. "I know what that is." Vince looked up. "I figured you did. Doesn't change anything," Harold said. Vince studied him. Really studied him the way a man does when he's trying to figure out if someone is lying or stupid or both. "That's so." "You were cold," Harold said. "That's all there is to it." Vince looked away. His jaw worked for a moment, like he was chewing on something that wouldn't go down easy. "Last time somebody helped me without asking for something first," he said quietly. "I was 11 years old. My grandmother. She gave me her coat in a bus station in Cincinnati because I'd left mine at school." Harold said nothing. He just listened. "She died that winter," Vince said. "Pneumonia." A long silence sat between them. "I'm sorry," Harold said. "Yeah," Vince said. "Me too." By 3 in the morning, the fever had climbed. Harold sat on the edge of his chair and watched Vince sleep, or try to. The big man's chest rising and falling in an uneven rhythm, a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead, despite the blanket Harold had tucked across him. He'd given him 4 aspirin. He'd brought down the second blanket from the shelf above the boiler. He was running through his options. A hospital was out. Vince had made that plain when he was still conscious enough to do so. No hospitals, no cops. You call either one of those, and you'll regret it. He hadn't said it with venom. He'd said it the way a man states a simple fact he expects to be believed. Harold had believed him. But he also knew that a fever that high left unaddressed could turn into something that no amount of aspirin in a basement room was going to fix. He spent the next hour alternating between checking Vince's temperature with an old ear thermometer he'd had since Dorothy was alive, and listening to the man's breathing through the thin wall between the cot and the boiler room. Around 4 a.m., the fever broke. Not dramatically. Quietly, the way most real crises resolve, not with a bang, but with a gradual settling. A body deciding to step back from the edge it had been standing on. Vince's breathing evened out. His color, which had gone from gray to almost white over the previous hours, came back in slow degrees. Harold let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. He poured himself another coffee and sat back down. He looked at the photograph of Dorothy on the wall. "You'd have done the same thing," he said to it. He was almost sure she would have agreed. The building had a routine like any building, and Harold knew it precisely. Dennis Pratt, the building manager, arrived every morning at 8:30. He spent the first 30 minutes in his office on the ground floor, reviewing maintenance reports, then did a walkthrough of the lobby and the common areas, before retreating back upstairs to whatever administrative tasks filled his days. He rarely came to the basement. Harold's service access corridor was separate from the main elevator bank. The only way anyone came down there was if Harold called them, or if there was a specific maintenance issue on the boiler. So for the moment, they were safe. But Harold was not a fool. He understood that for the moment was a very temporary arrangement. When Vince woke just after 7, Harold was already dressed and sitting with a fresh pot of coffee on the counter and 2 slices of toast on a paper plate beside it. Vince sat up slowly, wincing. He looked around the room. His eyes settled on Harold. "You stayed up." "Somebody had to watch the fever," Harold said. Vince rubbed a hand across his face. He looked down at the bandaged leg. "You cleaned it." "It was getting infected. It'll need watching, but you'll keep the leg." Vince let out a short sound, not quite a laugh, but something adjacent to it. "You're a strange man, Harold." "Eat your toast," Harold said. Vince reached for the plate. He ate in silence for a moment. "I need to reach my people," he said. "Let them know I'm alive." "There's a phone charger by the sink." Vince looked at it, looked back at Harold. "How do you know I won't make a call that brings 100 bikers to your front door?" Harold poured a second cup of coffee and set it beside Vince's plate. "Because you don't want anyone to know where you are. You said so yourself last night." Vince stared at him. "You were listening." "I was sitting 3 feet away," Harold said. "It'd be hard not to." A pause. Then slowly something in Vince's expression shifted. Just slightly, like a door opening a crack that had been locked for a very long time. "You really don't want anything from me," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was something closer to disbelief. "I want you to eat that second piece of toast," Harold said. "The bread goes stale by afternoon." Vince picked up the second piece. He ate it. At 8:15, Harold's phone buzzed. Dennis Pratt's number on the screen. Harold stepped out into the boiler room to take it, pulling the door almost but not quite closed behind him. "Harold?" Pratt's voice flat as always. "I need the East maintenance log updated before 9. Building inspections doing a soft review today." "I'll have it on your desk by 8:45, Harold said. "And Harold, I need you to clear that East alley again. One of the tenants reported seeing blood back there this morning." Harold's hand tightened on the phone. "Blood," he repeated. "Raccoon probably. Or some drunk. Just clean it up before the inspector sees it." "Yes, sir," Harold said. "I'll take care of it." He ended the call. He stood in the boiler room for a moment. Then he went back through the door. Vince was sitting up, coffee in hand, watching Harold's face the way a man watches a situation that might require rapid decision-making. Problem. "Building inspection today," Harold said. "Manager wants me to clean the alley, where you were last night." "Blood." "Yes." Vince set down the coffee cup. "How long do we have?" Harold checked his watch. 22 minutes before he expects the maintenance log and starts wondering why I haven't checked in." Vince nodded slowly. "Then you'd better go," he said. "I'll be here." Harold looked at him. "You'll stay." "I'll stay." Vince said it quietly without hesitation, like a promise, like a man who understood that the only currency he currently had to offer was his word. Harold nodded once. He picked up his mop. He went to clean the alley. It took him 14 minutes. The rain had washed away most of it, which helped. Harold worked quickly and efficiently and was back in Pratt's office with the updated maintenance log by 8:43. Pratt barely looked up from his desk. "Leave it there." Harold left it there. He walked back down to the basement. When he opened the door, Vince was still on the cot. He'd found Harold's old radio and turned it to a country station, low volume, and was sitting with his eyes closed, head tilted slightly back. He opened his eyes when Harold came in. "Everything good?" "Everything's fine," Harold said. He hung his mop on its hook. He sat down in his chair. He picked up his coffee. Vince looked at him for a long moment. "Harold." "Yeah, I've spent the last 23 years having people scared of me, Every room I walk into, somebody tenses up, somebody moves away, somebody's hand goes to their pocket or their phone or their waistband. Harold said nothing. You didn't do any of that, Vince said. Not last night, not this morning, not just now. I've been mopping floors in this building for 11 years, Harold said. People walk right past me every night like I'm not there. I know what it feels like to be looked through instead of at. Vince was quiet. That's different, he said. Is it? Another long silence. The old country station played something Harold half recognized from a long time ago. My son, Harold said slowly. Hasn't called me in 4 years. I don't know exactly why. I have my guesses. But I stopped understanding it after the first year, and after a while you just adjust to the shape of the empty space, and you keep moving. He paused. What I'm saying is, I know what invisible feels like from both sides of it, and I'm not interested in adding to it, yours or anybody else's. Vince looked at him with an expression Harold had never seen on a man that size before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't calculation. It was something rawer than either of those things. Something that looked, if Harold was reading it right, like a man trying very hard not to fall apart in front of someone who was essentially a stranger. My daughter, Vince said. His voice had dropped. She's 17. I haven't seen her in 3 years. Her mother won't, it's complicated. There are legal things I did that... He stopped. He pressed his lips together. I just want her to know, he said finally, that I'm not the thing people say I am. That somewhere in here there's still a person who used to read her bedtime stories and make her pancakes on Sunday mornings, and... He stopped again. Harold didn't fill the silence. He knew from years of living alone with his own unfinished sentences that sometimes silence is the only honest response. Sorry, Vince said roughly. I don't talk like this to anyone. You don't have to apologize, Harold said. And you don't have to stop. Vince looked at the ceiling. He exhaled slowly. What do you do, he said, when you've made so many wrong choices for so long that you can't even see the road back anymore? Harold set down his coffee cup. He thought about it carefully, the way he thought about things that deserved careful consideration. You take one step, he said. You don't look for the road. You just take one step in a direction that feels less wrong than the others. And then you take another one. And somewhere along the way you look back and there's a road behind you that wasn't there before. Vince was quiet for a very long time. That's the most optimistic thing I've heard in 20 years, he said. I'm 74 years old, Harold said. If I've learned anything, it's that optimism isn't stupidity. It's just experience that's decided to keep going instead of quit. The radio played. The boiler hummed. Outside, the storm that had nearly killed Vince Malone the night before was beginning to ease the rain, thinning the wind, losing its edge, the dark sky starting to lighten somewhere above the roof of Riverside Towers. Harold Bennett and Vince Malone sat in a basement room that smelled like coffee and old pipes, and something that might, if you were paying close enough attention, have been the very beginning of something neither of them had expected. Neither of them knew it yet. But the city above them was about to find out. The second day was quieter than the first. Vince slept most of the morning. Harold did his rounds, lobby stairwells, laundry room east corridor, the same route he had walked 1,000 times before, moving through the building like a ghost, while the tenants above him lived their lives without noticing. The floor was clean, or the bulbs were changed, or the pipes were holding together because an old man had spent the night crawling behind the heating unit with a wrench. He brought Vince lunch at noon. Canned tomato soup and half a sleeve of crackers. When he pushed open the basement door, Vince was sitting upright on the cot. Harold's worn copy of a Louis L'Amour novel open across his knee. He looked up. You read westerns, Vince said. I read whatever's there, Harold said. This guy gets shot in chapter 2 and walks it off by chapter 4. It was a different time, Harold said, and set the soup down on the corner of the cot. Vince looked at the bowl. Then he looked up at Harold. I need to tell you something, Vince said. Harold pulled the chair over and sat down. He didn't rush him. He'd learned years ago that rushing a man toward something he needed to say usually just pushed it further back inside him. Vince set the book aside. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and stared at the floor between his boots for a moment. "What happened in that alley?" he said. "It wasn't random." Harold said nothing. "There are people looking for me," Vince said. "Not cops. Worse than cops." Harold absorbed that. "How close?" he said. "I don't know. Close enough that I ended up in that alley and not somewhere better." "Are they going to come here?" "Not if they don't know I'm here." Vince looked at him directly. "But Harold, I need you to understand what I'm telling you. If they find me and you're between me and them, that becomes your problem too. And you didn't sign up for that." Harold picked up his own cup of coffee. He took a slow sip. "I signed up for it the minute I picked you up off that concrete," he said. "So that ship's already sailed." Vince stared at him. "You're not scared." "I'm 74, Harold said. "What are they going to do? Take away my mop." Something crossed Vince's face. Not a smile exactly. Something older than a smile. "I'm going to make a call," Vince said. "One call. To someone I trust. I need to let my chapter know I'm breathing. Phone charger's still by the sink. If I make this call, certain people will know I'm alive. That'll buy us some time. But it also starts a clock." "What kind of clock?" Vince stood carefully testing the leg, letting it bear his weight before committing to it fully. He moved to the sink and plugged in a battered phone Harold hadn't noticed tucked into the inside pocket of the leather jacket. "The kind," Vince said, "that ends with a lot of motorcycles." Harold set down his coffee cup. "How many B," he said, "is a lot." Vince looked at him steadily. "More than this street has ever seen." Harold looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked his cup back up. "Let me know when you're making the call," he said. "I'll give you some privacy." Vince shook his head slowly, like a man watching something he couldn't quite categorize. "Harold." "Yeah? I've walked into federal courthouses with more nerves than you're showing right now." "The difference," Harold said, "is that I'm not doing anything wrong. There's a certain freedom in that." Vince didn't answer, but he held on to those words. Harold could see it the way a man holds on to something that hits him somewhere he wasn't expecting. The call lasted 4 minutes. Harold stood in the boiler room with his coffee, listening to the hum of the heating unit, not listening to the conversation on the other side of the wall. When Vince knocked twice on the doorframe, their unspoken signal established, without either of them having to say it, Harold came back through. Vince was standing with the phone still in his hand. His expression had changed. "What happened?" Harold said. "My road brother," Vince said. "He told me something." Harold waited. "About this building." Harold set down his cup very slowly. "What about it?" Vince looked at him, not the way he'd looked at Harold before, with that measuring what do you want calculation behind his eyes, but straight and direct, and with something that looked very much like concern. "How long have you lived here, Harold?" 11 years, you said. 11 years in March. And in 11 years, has anyone ever told you officially on paper in writing that this building was going to be sold? The question landed in Harold's chest like something physical. "Sold," he repeated. "My brother's been monitoring some legal filings. City Development Board. There's a sale pending on this building, Harold. Has been for 8 months. Harold sat down slowly in his chair. 8 months, he said. The new buyer has a demolition permit ready. Everything above ground comes down. They're building luxury condominiums. Harold didn't speak. He looked at the photographs on the wall. Dorothy laughing at the church. Marcus holding up his fish. The Niagara Falls postcard. The tenants, he said quietly, being evicted. Legally on paper, but the process they've been using to push people out. My brother says it's not clean. Rent hikes, false maintenance violations, harassment. Elderly residents especially. People who don't have lawyers. People who don't know how to fight back. Harold was very still. And the building manager, Harold said. It wasn't a question. Dennis Pratt, Vince said, and the name coming out of his mouth told Harold that Vince already knew it, had known it before Harold said it. He's been processing the eviction paperwork, taking a cut of the sale, pocketing maintenance funds that were supposed to go to repairs. Harold thought about the third-floor hallway that had needed new light fixtures for 6 weeks and kept getting bumped from the maintenance list. He thought about Mrs. Dawson on the 7th floor, 81 years old, who'd received a rent increase notice last month that she hadn't understood and had come to Harold in the hallway paper in her shaking hands, asking him if he knew what it meant. He'd told her it was probably a formality. He'd believed that when he said it. He didn't believe it anymore. "When does it go through?" Harold said. "End of January, 2.5 months. "And my room," Harold said. Vince was quiet for a moment. "You're not listed in the building registry, Harold. As far as the official documentation is concerned, the basement apartment doesn't exist." Harold looked at him. "Which means," Vince said, "when they clear this building, nobody's obligated to relocate you, or even notify you." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Harold had lived through hard things. He'd buried a wife. He'd learned to sleep without someone beside him. He'd watched his son become a stranger. He'd eaten alone beside a radio for years without letting it turn him bitter. But this sitting in his own room, the room he had made a life inside of 11 years of a quiet life, and being told that someone had decided without asking him, without even acknowledging he existed, that it was going to be taken away. That was a different kind of hard. "Harold." Vince's voice was careful, measured. The voice of a man who understood that the next few seconds mattered. "I need you to hear me." Harold looked up. "I'm not going to let that happen." Harold shook his head slowly. "Vince, you're a man with a fever and a cut leg hiding in a basement. What exactly are you going to—" "I made 2 calls," Vince said. Harold stopped. The second one was to my chapter president. A long beat of silence. "I told him where I was," Vince continued. "I told him what I found out about this building. And I told him about you." Harold stared at him. "What did you tell him about me?" "The truth," Vince said simply. "That a 74-year-old man who didn't know me from a stone in the road picked me up out of a rainstorm because he decided that watching someone suffer wasn't something he was willing to do." Harold put his hands on his knees. "Vince, he wants to come." "No." "Harold, no." Harold's voice was firm, not loud, not angry, just absolutely certain. "I don't need anyone to fight my battles. I've been doing this a long time on my own, and 7 people from this building have already been illegally evicted in the last 4 months, Vince said. Harold went silent. A woman named Carol Hutchins, 78 years old, Unit 4C. She's in a shelter on the east side of the city right now because she couldn't find anywhere else to go. Vince's voice hadn't risen, but it had hardened. A retired postal worker named George Abrams, 69, Unit 6A. He had 60 days to clear out of a home he'd lived in for 14 years. A mother with 2 kids on the 2nd floor got slapped with a lease violation for a broken window screen that maintenance never fixed. Harold stared at him. "How do you know all of this?" "Because my brother's been watching this building for 3 weeks, Vince said. "Looking for something exactly like this. Crooked development deals are a specialty of a certain city councilman who owes money to people who are not patient about being owed money. We've been following the thread." He paused. "We just didn't know there was a man in the basement keeping the lights on for the people who were left." Harold sat with that for a long moment. Carol Hutchins, Unit 4C. He remembered her. Small woman, white hair, always wore a blue cardigan. She used to leave a cup of coffee outside her door for Harold on cold nights. He'd assumed she moved to be closer to family. He'd assumed. He'd assumed because nobody told him otherwise. Because nobody told him anything. Because Harold Bennett was invisible. "If your people come here," Harold said slowly, "it's going to make things worse. Management will call the police. The police will remove them. The story becomes about bikers, not about the building. The corruption gets buried under the headline." Vince looked at him. He looked at him for a long time. "You've thought about this," he said. "I think about everything," Harold said. "I've got a lot of quiet time." "So what do you want to do?" Harold leaned back in his chair. "I want to get the documentation first. I want to see what's on paper, what's missing from paper, who signed what and when. Then," he paused, "then we talk about what kind of help makes sense." Vince was quiet. Then very slowly the corner of his mouth turned up. "You know," he said, "you're a hell of a lot more dangerous than you look." "I'm a janitor," Harold said. "I have master key access to every room in this building, including the manager's office, including the filing cabinet beside his desk that he locks every night and forgets I have the override for." The silence that followed had a different quality than the ones before it. "Harold," Vince said. "I'm not doing anything illegal," Harold said calmly. "I'm doing maintenance. It's my job. If I happen to observe documents during the course of routine access, that's just a man doing his rounds." Vince stared at him. "When?" he said. "Tonight," Harold said. "After midnight. Pratt always leaves by 6 and he doesn't have cameras in his office. He thinks I'm too old to be worth watching." Something shifted in Vince's face. That same expression Harold had caught glimpses of before, the one that was too young for a man his age and too old for a man who was supposed to be hard. "You'd do this," Vince said. "For people who've never even looked at you." Harold shrugged. "Mrs. Dawson on 7 makes me a plate of cookies every Christmas. Mr. Abrams used to ask me about the Guardians every time he saw me in the elevator. There's a kid on the 4th floor, 9 years old, named Tommy, who always holds the door and says good evening." He paused. "Those people look at me. Maybe they're the only ones, but they do." Vince rubbed a hand over his jaw. "And Pratt," he said. "Dennis Pratt," Harold said, and his voice had gone to a quiet level place that was somehow more final than anger, "has been stealing from elderly people and calling it business. And I've been mopping his floors without knowing it for 8 months. He stood up. He picked up his mop. "I'm going to finish my rounds," he said. "You rest that leg. I'll be back at 11. He was at the door when Vince said his name. He stopped. "Nobody in 30 years, Vince said quietly, "has ever made me feel like a person first and a problem second." Harold looked back at him. "You're not a problem," Harold said. "You're just a man who needed to come in out of the rain." He went back to work. He mopped the same floors he always mopped. He changed a burned-out bulb on the 9th floor. He tightened a dripping faucet in the 2nd floor laundry room. He checked the boiler pressure. He ate his dinner microwaved beef stew sitting on the edge of his cot at 9 o'clock, while Vince ate across from him, and they listened to the radio and talked about things that had nothing to do with corruption or motorcycles or the slow erasure of a life. Vince talked about his daughter. Her name was Elena. She was 17 and apparently already smarter than everyone around her, which Vince said with a pride that was so enormous and so obviously painful that Harold had to look at the wall for a moment. Harold talked about Dorothy, about the way she used to burn everything she tried to cook and refused to acknowledge it and serve it with complete confidence anyway. About how she had laughed big and unself-conscious, the kind of laugh that made other people want to know what was funny. "She sounds like someone you could hear in a whole building," Vince said. "You could hear her in the next building," Harold said. "Drove the neighbors crazy. We loved it." At 11:15, Harold put on his work gloves, picked up his maintenance clipboard, and walked upstairs to Dennis Pratt's office. The building was quiet. He let himself in with the override key. The office smelled like Pratt's aftershave and stale coffee. Harold didn't turn on the overhead light. He used the small flashlight he kept on his keyring, the one he used for checking the boiler's pilot indicator in tight spaces, and he moved to the filing cabinet in the corner. The drawer was labeled Legal/Financial 2024. Harold was systematic. He'd spent 31 years reading technical schematics in a steel plant. He knew how to move through documentation without getting lost in it. He went through the files efficiently, turning pages carefully so nothing was out of order when he left. 40 minutes later, he closed the drawer. He stood in the dark office for a moment. Then he walked back downstairs. When he came through the basement door, Vince was sitting up. He read Harold's face immediately, Years of reading rooms had made him quick at it. "What did you find?" he said. Harold sat down. He put his hands flat on his knees. 7 eviction notices processed in the last 5 months. 3 of them were filed on false pretenses, maintenance violation codes that don't correspond to any actual work order in the system. Because I have the work order system. He paused. A sales contract with a development company called Orion Residential Group, signed by Pratt and countersigned by a city official whose name appears on the planning board. Another pause. And a separate account number, handwritten on a notepad inside the drawer, with transaction amounts going back 16 months. Vince was very still. "How much?" he said. Harold told him. Vince exhaled slowly through his nose. "Harold," he said. "I know. That's not just Pratt, that's organized. I know. You need documentation, photos, something that can actually be used." "I took them," Harold said quietly. Vince looked at him. Harold held up his phone. An old Samsung, the kind that most people had stopped using 3 years ago. "The camera still works," Harold said. Vince stared at him for a long moment. Then he sat back and pressed both hands over his face. "You went in there," he said, voice muffled behind his hands, "with a flashlight and a museum-piece phone and just documented government corruption." "I documented my building's paperwork," Harold said. "Whether that constitutes government corruption is for people smarter than me to sort out." Vince dropped his hands. He looked at Harold with an expression Harold had never seen directed at him before, not in 11 years at Riverside Towers, not in 31 years at the plant. It was the expression of a man who was genuinely completely astonished. "Send those photos to me," Vince said. His voice had shifted the fever and exhaustion softness of the past 2 days, hardening into something focused and purposeful. "Right now. Tonight. And then I make a call in the morning." He paused. "Harold, do you trust me?" The question landed cleanly. Harold thought about it for exactly as long as it deserved. "You could have walked out of here yesterday morning when the fever broke," Harold said. "You didn't. So yes, I trust you." Vince nodded once. "Then let me make my calls tomorrow," he said. "And then something's going to happen that you can't stop, and I won't apologize for." "What kind of something?" Vince looked at him steadily. "The kind," he said, "that makes sure Dennis Pratt is the one who ends up with nowhere to go." Harold looked at the photograph of Dorothy on the wall. He thought about Carol Hutchins in a shelter on the east side. George Abrams with 60 days' notice. Tommy on the 4th floor who said good evening. He thought about the notepad in the filing cabinet, and the 16 months of stolen money, and the 7 families processed out of their homes through forged maintenance violations. He thought about the fact that nobody had told him. Nobody had thought to tell him. Because Harold Bennett was the janitor. Harold Bennett was invisible. "Make your calls," Harold said. He turned off the lamp. In the dark room, the old radio played low. The boiler hummed its steady, faithful hum, and somewhere above them, 12 stories of people were sleeping without knowing that the 2 most unlikely men in the city were sitting in a basement together, deciding that invisible was no longer going to be good enough. The calls started at 6:15 in the morning. Harold knew because he heard Vince's voice through the wall, low and steady at first, then picking up a kind of contained energy that reminded Harold of the way pressure builds inside a pipe before something finally gives. He didn't listen to the words. He made coffee, ate 2 pieces of toast, and waited. Vince came through the door at 7:40 with a different energy in his body than Harold had seen since the alley. The fever was gone. The leg was holding him. And whatever conversation had just happened had lit something behind his eyes that hadn't been there 2 days ago. "Talk to me," Harold said. Vince sat down across from him. He put his hands on his knees and leaned forward. "My chapter president contacted 6 other chapters last night," he said, "after I sent him your photos." Harold nodded slowly. "Those photos went to an attorney in Columbus who specializes in municipal corruption. She had them by midnight. By 4 this morning, she'd cross-referenced 3 of the eviction filings against City Code and found procedural violations on all 3. Vince paused. She's filing an emergency injunction today to halt the demolition permit. Harold set down his coffee cup. That's fast, he said. She's very good, Vince said. And she doesn't like Dennis Pratt. Apparently he's done this before. Different building, different neighborhood, same playbook. She's been waiting for documentation she could actually use. And the city official whose name was on the contract? Vince looked at him steadily. Councilman Ray Thibodeau, 13th District. He's been on the planning board for 9 years, and he has a very interesting relationship with Orion Residential Group. Vince paused. Interesting enough that 3 local journalists my chapter contacted last night are already making calls this morning. Harold absorbed all of it. One piece at a time, the way you absorb anything that's larger than expected. Vince, he said, you did all of this overnight. We did all of this overnight, Vince said. Your photos were the foundation. Without those, there's no attorney, no injunction, no journalists. Without you going into that office with a flashlight and a 10-year-old phone. He stopped. None of this moves. Harold was quiet for a moment. There's something else, Vince said. Harold looked up. My chapter is coming today. Harold opened his mouth. Before you say no, Vince said, hear me out. They're not coming to intimidate anyone. They're not coming to make a scene. They're coming because Harold. There's something about this story that spread faster than I expected. My president told 6 chapters. Those 6 chapters told others. I don't know exactly how it happened, but by midnight last night, chapters from Pittsburgh and Cincinnati and Indianapolis were asking for the address. Harold stared at him. Why? He said. Vince was quiet for a moment. Because, he said, a lot of the men in those chapters are veterans, ex-cons, people who know what it means to be invisible, people who've had things taken from them and had nobody stand up about it. He paused. And because I told them what you said to me in that alley. 7 words. And apparently those 7 words traveled further than either of us thought they would. Harold said nothing. How many? He said finally. Vince pressed his lips together. As of an hour ago, he said, the count was somewhere north of 1,200. The number hit Harold like a physical thing. 12. He stopped. Vince. Could be more by this afternoon. Harold stood up. He walked the 3 steps to the sink and stood there with his hands on the counter looking at the wall. This is going to terrify people, he said. The residents, the families. There are children in this building. There are elderly people who... I know, Vince said. I've already told my president. The approach will be controlled, organized. No aggression, no confrontation with residents. Bikes line the street, quiet engines off. Nobody enters the building without an invitation. Nobody raises their voice. He paused. Harold, these men understand how to make a statement without making a threat. They do it better than anyone. Harold turned around. And if Pratt calls the police, then the police arrive and find 1,200 men standing peacefully on a public street with every lawyer in 3 chapters on speed dial. Vince met his eyes. The story becomes national the second a cop gets aggressive with a group that large over nothing. And Thibodeau knows that. Harold looked at Vince for a long time. You've thought this through, he said. I've had 2 days lying on your cot while you mopped hallways, Vince said. I did a lot of thinking. Harold exhaled slowly. He looked at the photograph of Dorothy on the wall. That laugh. That enormous, unapologetic laugh. She would have thought this was absolutely insane, he said quietly. And, Vince said. Harold almost smiled. And she would have made coffee for every single one of them. Vince stood up. He was moving better now, the legs still stiff, but bearing weight, the rest of him restored to something close to the man he'd been before that rainstorm. There's one more thing, he said. Harold looked at him. I want to tell them about you, Vince said. I want to stand in front of every one of those men and say your name and tell them what you did. Not for me, for the building, for the people being pushed out. He held Harold's gaze. I want you to be visible, Harold. Maybe for the first time in a long time. and I want to ask your permission to do that." Harold looked down at his hands, his worn, clean, hard-working hands. "You don't need my permission," Harold said quietly. "Yes, I do," Vince said. "Because it's your story, and you spent too many years with people deciding things about you without asking." The room was very still. "All right," Harold said. "Then yes, you have my permission." Vince nodded once. "Thank you," he said. Harold picked up his mop. "I have rounds to finish," he said. "The building doesn't clean itself." He was at the door when his phone rang. Dennis Pratt's number. Harold answered it. "Harold." Pratt's voice was different this morning, higher, tighter, like a string pulled past its tuning. "I need you upstairs, right now, my office." Harold kept his voice exactly the same as it always was. "Yes, sir," he said. "Give me 10 minutes." He hung up. He looked back at Vince. "Pratt," he said. Vince's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. "Does he know?" "I don't know what he knows," Harold said. "But his voice is scared, and scared people do things they wouldn't otherwise do." "You don't have to go up there alone," Vince said. "Yes, I do," Harold said. "Because a 74-year-old janitor walking into his manager's office is completely normal. A Hells Angels road captain walking in with him is a different story." He straightened his collar. "I'll be back in 20 minutes." He went upstairs. Pratt was standing behind his desk when Harold came in. That was the first thing Harold noticed. He wasn't sitting. A man who sits is a man who feels in control of his space. A man who stands is a man who's been pacing and just stopped when he heard the door. "Close it," Pratt said. Harold closed the door. He stood in front of the desk with his hands at his sides and his face arranged in the patient, neutral expression he'd spent 11 years perfecting, the face that said, "I'm just the janitor. Nothing more interesting than that." "I got a call this morning," Pratt said, "from a woman who said she was an attorney. She said she was filing an injunction against the building's demolition permit." Harold said nothing. "She referenced specific eviction filings," Pratt said, "by case number, by date, by code violation." He leaned forward with both fists on the desk. "Harold, those files are in a locked cabinet in this office." Harold looked at him calmly. "I wouldn't know anything about that, Mr. Pratt." "Really?" Pratt's voice was flat and hard. "Because the only person in this building with a maintenance override for this room is you." "Maintenance override is for emergency access," Harold said. "Burst pipes, fire safety, boiler emergencies. I haven't had a reason to access your office." The lie was absolutely clean. Harold had spent 31 years in a steel plant where the difference between a good weld and a failed one was invisible to the naked eye. He understood that some things had to hold under pressure, even when you couldn't see the seam. Pratt stared at him. "I want you to know something," Pratt said, and his voice had dropped into a register that was meant to feel like a threat. "This building is going to be sold. It's going through. Whatever this attorney thinks she has, it won't be enough. And when it goes through..." He paused deliberately. "The basement apartment isn't on any official tenant registry. You understand what that means." Harold looked at him. "It means I'm not a tenant," Harold said. "It means you don't have rights," Pratt said. "To relocation assistance, to notice, to anything. When they start demolition, you've got 24 hours to clear your things, and that's it." Harold was completely still. Pratt leaned back, apparently satisfied. "So whatever you think you know," Pratt said, "think about whether it's worth your home." Harold looked at Dennis Pratt across that desk. He thought about Dorothy. He thought about Marcus. He thought about 11 years of mopping floors and changing bulbs and fixing pipes in the dark, while the people above him went about their lives. He thought about Carol Hutchins in a shelter. He thought about Tommy on the 4th floor saying good evening. He thought about 7 words spoken in a rainstorm. "I appreciate you telling me that, Mr. Pratt," Harold said. He turned and walked out of the office. He went back downstairs. He came through the basement door, and Vince was on his feet before Harold had finished closing it, reading his face with the speed of a man trained to assess damage quickly. "What did he say?" Vince said. Harold sat down. He told him every word. When he finished, Vince was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then he picked up his phone. "Who are you calling?" Harold said. "My president," Vince said. "To move the timeline up." The phone rang twice. "Bobby," Vince said. "Change of plans. We need everyone here by tomorrow morning, not afternoon." A pause. I know it's faster. Just..." Another pause. "Because the man who helped me just got threatened by the person who's been stealing from elderly residents for 16 months, and I'm not going to let him sit in this basement alone for another 12 hours. He paused again. "Yes, tomorrow morning. Tell them to be quiet about it. Engines off 2 blocks out." A final pause. "Thank you." He hung up. He looked at Harold. "Tomorrow morning," Vince said, "before Pratt gets here." Harold sat with that. He nodded. That night, neither of them slept much. They sat with the radio and the coffee and the particular kind of conversation that happens between people who know that tomorrow will be different from everything before it. Vince told Harold about the chapter, not the mythology, not the reputation, but the actual men. The Vietnam veterans who'd come home to nothing and found brotherhood in the only place that offered it. The men who'd lost everything in one crisis or another and rebuilt themselves on the road. The fathers who'd made mistakes and spent years trying to become someone their children could be proud of. "They're not what people think," Vince said. "Most people aren't," Harold said. "No," Vince said. "But we made it easier for them to think it. We wore it like armor for so long it started to feel like skin." Harold understood that. He thought about his own armor. The invisible man routine, the patient neutral face, the don't expect anything, and you won't be disappointed approach to daily life that he'd built around himself after Dorothy died. "Sometimes the armor becomes the cage," Harold said. Vince looked at him. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That's exactly what it becomes." They fell into a comfortable silence for a while. Then Vince said, "What are you afraid of tomorrow, I mean? What's the thing that actually scares you about it?" Harold thought about it honestly. "That it doesn't work," he said. "That Thibodeau has enough power to make the injunction disappear. That Pratt has already moved the paperwork somewhere we can't reach. That all of this, your people coming, the attorney, the journalists, that it's not enough, and these families still lose their homes, and I still lose this room, and all it did was make more noise." "That's a real fear," Vince said. "Yes. You know what I'm afraid of." Harold waited. "That it does work," Vince said. "And then I go back to what I was. I go back to being Reaper, the thing people are scared of, and you go back to mopping hallways at midnight and eating soup alone." He shook his head slowly. "I've been running from something for 20 years, Harold. And the first time I stop running, I end up in an alley in the rain, and an old man picks me up and makes me chicken noodle soup." He paused. "I'm afraid that when this is over, I won't know what to do with the kind of person I want to be instead." Harold looked at him for a long time. "You already started," Harold said. 3 phone calls ago. That's already who you're being." Vince pressed his lips together. "Get some sleep," Harold said. "Tomorrow's going to be loud." At 5:30 in the morning, Harold's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. 3 words. 2 blocks out. Harold read it. He set the phone down. He looked at the ceiling. He got up. He put on his work uniform. He made a pot of coffee. He stood at the small ground-level window near the ceiling and watched the dark street and waited. At 5:52, he felt it before he heard it. A vibration, low and steady, coming through the concrete walls, through the floor, through the soles of his shoes. Then the sound, a deep rolling thunder that wasn't thunder, that was mechanical and rhythmic and massive and getting closer and closer, and then silence. Total, complete, absolute silence. No engines. No voices. Nothing. Harold went upstairs. He pushed open the front door of Riverside Towers and stepped outside into the cold November morning. He stopped. The street was full of motorcycles as far as he could see in both directions. Chrome and leather, and the warm fog of breath and cold air rising from hundreds of faces that were all turned toward the same building, toward the same door, toward Harold. He couldn't count them. He tried and couldn't. His mind kept losing the number. Later people would say 1,800. The police report would say 1,843. Harold would never be able to think of them as a number. He could only think of them as a presence, enormous, and still, and somehow impossibly quiet. Not a single engine running, not a single voice. Just the sound of the city waking up around something it didn't understand yet. Above him a window opened. Then another. Faces appeared. Residents looking down at the street, their expressions cycling through confusion and alarm, and something that hadn't found a word yet. A door opened behind Harold. Then another. Tenants stepping into the lobby behind him, pressing forward to see through the glass. Someone said, "What is this?" Someone else said, "Should we call the police?" Harold heard a child's voice. Tommy's voice, he thought, from the 4th floor drifting down. "Mom, Mom, come look. Mom, there's so many of them." Then a figure came through the crowd. Vince Malone walked forward from the edge of the street, moving through the parked bikes with the natural ease of a man who had done this his whole life. He was wearing his jacket. The Death's Head patch was visible. The road captain insignia. The name Reaper stitched beneath it. He stopped in front of Harold, and then loudly, clearly, in a voice that carried across that street and up the face of that building and into every open window, he said, "This man saved my life." Silence. Complete silence. Harold stood very still. Vince turned to face the street. His voice rose. 3 nights ago, I was dying in the alley behind this building. I was sick, and I was hurt, and I was alone, and any reasonable person would have walked right past me. This man did not walk past me. He paused. His name is Harold Bennett. He's been the janitor of this building for 11 years. He has spent 11 years keeping this place standing while the person who manages it has been stealing from the people who live here, evicting elderly residents on false charges, taking money that was supposed to go to your heat and your repairs and your safety, selling this building out from underneath you to a developer who intends to tear it down. The silence from above had changed. It was no longer the silence of confusion. It was the silence of people holding their breath. "I'm asking you," Vince said. And now his voice dropped, and somehow the drop made it carry further, "not to be afraid of us. We came here to stand with one man who chose compassion over fear, and paid for it with a threat. We came here because what is happening to this building has happened before, and it will keep happening until someone decides to stop it." He turned back to Harold. And then, in a movement that started with Vince and spread outward through the street like a wave moving across water, 1,800 men reached up and removed their helmets and bowed their heads. Harold Bennett. Janitor, 74 years old. Invisible man stood on the steps of Riverside Towers and looked at a street full of people who had come from Pittsburgh and Cincinnati and Indianapolis and places further than that to bow their heads for him. He didn't cry. He was a man who had made a practice of not crying, a practice that went back to a hospital room in 2016 and had held ever since. But his hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against his thighs so nobody would see. Behind him, he heard the lobby door open. He heard footsteps. He heard someone, Mrs. Dawson, he thought, from the 7th floor. And he was right, say in a voice barely above a whisper, "Harold, Harold, who are all these people?" Harold didn't turn around right away. He looked at the street. He looked at Vince, who was watching him with an expression that was not triumph and not satisfaction, but something much quieter and much older than either. Then he turned to Mrs. Dawson. She was standing in the doorway in her blue cardigan, 81 years old, white hair still in its nighttime curl. Her hands clasped together at her sternum in the particular way she held them when she was frightened. "Friends," Harold said. She looked at the street. She looked at him. Friends, she repeated softly. Yes, ma'am, Harold said. They're here about the building. There are some things about this building that you need to know, Mrs. Dawson. Things that should have been told to you a long time ago. He paused. I'm sorry I didn't know sooner. Her eyes searched his face. Are we going to be all right? She said. Harold looked at the street, at Vince, at 1,800 men standing in the cold morning with their helmets in their hands. Yes, Harold said. He said it the way he had said very few things in his life, without qualification, without hedge, without the careful, measured doubt of a man who had been disappointed by promises. He said it like he meant it completely. We're going to be all right. The first police cruiser arrived at 6:22. Then two more. Then a van from a local news station whose overnight desk editor had received a tip at 5 a.m. and dispatched a crew on instinct. Then a second news van. Dennis Pratt arrived at 6:40 minutes before his usual time, clearly summoned by something, possibly a neighbor, possibly the police scanner, and stopped his car at the edge of the block where the street was no longer passable. Harold watched him from the steps. Pratt got out of his car. He stood at the end of the block and looked at what was in front of him, and his face went through several things in rapid succession: disbelief, calculation, and then something that Harold recognized as the expression of a man who has just understood that the thing he thought he had managed is no longer managed. Their eyes met across the distance. Harold held his gaze. He did not look away. Pratt looked away first. Beside Harold, Vince said quietly, "There she is." Harold looked to the left. A woman in a dark coat was coming down the sidewalk with a briefcase and a purpose in her stride that cut through the crowd without effort. Mid-40s, sharp eyes, the kind of face that had learned to be unimpressed by large rooms of people who wanted her to back down. "The attorney," Harold said. "Rachel Okafor," Vince said. "Best corruption lawyer in Ohio, and she has your photos." She reached the steps. She looked at Harold. "Mr. Bennett," she said. "I've been looking forward to meeting you." She shook his hand firmly. "We have a lot of work to do, and very little time to do it. Are you ready?" Harold looked at her. He looked at Vince. He looked at the street full of people who had come because 7 words in a rainstorm had found their way somehow from a basement in Cleveland to somewhere much larger than Harold had ever imagined. "Yes," Harold said. He had been ready for a very long time. He just hadn't known there was anyone waiting on the other side. Rachel Okafor didn't waste time on pleasantries. She set her briefcase on the lobby bench, opened it, pulled out a thick folder, and started talking before Harold had even fully closed the front door behind them. Vince stood to the side. 2 men from the chapter Broad Quiet Watchful had come inside with Rachel without being asked and positioned themselves near the lobby entrance, in a way that was clearly intentional and clearly not going anywhere. "The injunction was filed at 5:40 this morning," Rachel said. "A federal judge in the Northern District of Ohio signed a temporary restraining order on the demolition permit at 6:05. That order is valid for 14 days, pending a full hearing." She looked up from the folder. "Which means Orion Residential Group cannot touch this building for 2 weeks. Harold exhaled. "That's 2 weeks, he said carefully. "2 weeks is enough," she said. "If we move correctly." She pulled a document from the folder and handed it to Harold. "I need you to look at this and confirm that what you photographed matches what's here. Every case number, every violation code, every eviction date." Harold took the document. He read it carefully the way he read everything all the way through, no skimming, no assumptions. "This is accurate," he said. "All of it. Every case number, every date." He handed it back. "The 4th entry down 4C, that's Carol Hutchins. She was in Unit 4C for 9 years. I want to make sure her name is right." Rachel looked down at the document. "It is," she said. "And Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Hutchins, is one of 6 former tenants my office contacted this morning. She's agreed to be a witness." Harold held very still. "You found her," he said. "She's in a shelter on Denison Avenue. She said she'd been wondering for 3 months if anyone would ever—" Rachel stopped herself. She was a professional who did not typically pause mid-sentence, and the pause itself said something. She said she'd given up on anyone doing anything. Harold looked at the floor for a moment. He pressed his lips together. "What do you need from me?" he said. "A formal statement. Everything you observed in that office. The condition of the maintenance records, the discrepancy between filed violations and actual work orders. You understand that your statement will be on record." "I understand." "And you understand that Pratt's attorneys will attempt to characterize your access to that office as unauthorized." "I have a maintenance override," Harold said. "I have 11 years of documented emergency access. I have the work order logs that prove every legitimate use." He paused. "I also have the logs showing no work orders were filed for any of the violations used to evict those residents." Rachel looked at him. "You have the work order logs." "I generate the work order logs," Harold said. "I always have. Pratt never asked to see them. He assumed I was just the janitor." Rachel Okafor smiled for the first time since she'd walked through the door. It was a very particular kind of smile, the smile of a lawyer who has just been handed the piece that makes everything else fit. "Mr. Bennett," she said, "I need those logs by 9 o'clock." "I'll have them to you by 8:30, Harold said. He turned and walked toward the basement stairs. Then he stopped and looked back. "There are elderly residents in this building," he said, "who need to understand what's happening. They've been frightened by what's outside and they deserve an explanation." He paused. "Can you do that while I get the logs?" Rachel nodded. "I'll speak to them in the lobby," she said. "Vince." She looked at him. "Is there someone from outside who can make sure the residents feel comfortable coming downstairs?" Vince looked at the two men by the door. One of them, late 40s, wide shoulders, a long scar along his jaw that had clearly healed well, but never disappeared, nodded once. "Bobby Ray will handle it," Vince said. Harold went downstairs. He was back in 18 minutes with a full printed copy of 3 years of work order logs, organized by date and unit number with a handwritten note on top indicating the specific page numbers corresponding to each of the contested eviction cases. He handed it to Rachel in the lobby. She looked at the handwritten note. "You indexed it," she said. "Saves time," Harold said. She tucked it under her arm and looked at the group of residents who had gathered in the lobby. 12 people ranging from a young mother with a toddler on her hip to Mrs. Dawson in her blue cardigan, to a heavy-set man in his 60s named Frank Torres from the 3rd floor, who Harold knew primarily as the man whose sink had backed up 4 times in 2 years. "Is this everyone?" Rachel said. "There are others," Harold said quietly. "Some are afraid to come down. Some are elderly and don't move quickly in the mornings." He paused. "Give them time." Frank Torres, who had been looking from Harold to Rachel to the 2 large men by the door, with an expression of barely contained alarm, finally said what everyone was thinking. "Harold, what the hell is going on?" Harold looked at him. "Sit down, Frank," he said. "There's a lot to tell you." He told them, not Rachel, Harold. He stood in the lobby of Riverside Towers and told the residents of his building, calmly, directly, without softening it, more than was honest. What he had found in the filing cabinet. What had been done to the 7 families who were no longer there. What was planned for the building and what was happening right now to stop it. He watched their faces as he spoke. Frank Torres went from alarmed to angry so fast it was like watching a switch flip. The young mother. Her name was Jessica Park. She had lived on the 2nd floor for 4 years. With her son went pale, and then pressed her lips together in a way that Harold recognized as someone deciding they were not going to cry in public. Mrs. Dawson listened with her hands clasped the way she always held them. When Harold finished, she said quietly, "I received a letter last month. It said I had a lease violation for my kitchen cabinet being improperly secured." She paused. "I didn't understand what that meant. I just thought it was some kind of paperwork." "It was the beginning of the process," Rachel said, stepping forward. "They send those letters first. If you don't respond correctly, and most people don't because most people have no reason to know they need to respond, it becomes a formal violation on record. Then they use it." Mrs. Dawson was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is there anything I can do?" "Yes," Rachel said. "You can let me help you." Outside, the police situation had evolved. Two officers had come to the building entrance and asked to speak with someone in charge. Vince had handled it with a composure that clearly unsettled the officers, who had apparently expected something more volatile. He had explained politely and specifically that the group was gathered peacefully on a public street to bear witness to an ongoing legal proceeding. He had given them the case number for Rachel's injunction. He had given them the name of the federal judge who signed it. The officers had gone back to their cruiser. They had not returned. At 9:15, Harold's phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer it. Then something made him. "Is this Harold Bennett?" A man's voice. Careful, measured with a controlled quality that Harold had learned to recognize from a lifetime of working for people who were never quite sure whether they respected him. "Speaking," Harold said. "Mr. Bennett, my name is Daniel Cho. I'm a reporter with the Cleveland Plain Dealer. I've been following the Thibodeau Planning Board for 8 months. I received documentation this morning that I believe originates from you." A pause. "I'd like to talk." Harold looked across the lobby at Rachel. She was deep in conversation with Jessica Park Penn, moving across a legal pad. He looked at Vince, who was standing near the window watching the street with his arms crossed and his back straight. "How long will it take?" Harold said. 20 minutes, 30 at most." "Come to the front entrance," Harold said. "Tell the men outside you're here to see Harold. Someone will bring you in." He hung up. Frank Torres appeared at his elbow. "Harold," Frank said. "I've been living in this building for 7 years. I never even knew your first name until this morning." Harold looked at him. "It's Harold," he said. Frank extended his hand. Harold shook it. Frank said. Unnecessarily, since Harold knew perfectly well, but the gesture was the point. "What can I do? Tell me what to do and I'll do it." Harold thought about it. "There are people in this building who haven't come downstairs yet," he said. "Elderly people, people who might not understand what's happening. Can you knock on doors?" Frank Torres was already moving toward the elevator. Daniel Cho arrived at 9:30. He was younger than Harold expected, early 30s, small and precise-looking, with the kind of focused energy that reminded Harold of Rachel. He shook Harold's hand and then sat across from him on the lobby bench with a recorder between them, and asked questions that told Harold within the first 5 minutes that this man already knew most of the answers and was just looking for Harold to confirm them, which Harold did, steadily, specifically, without embellishment. When it was over, Cho sat back and looked at Harold with an expression that was partly professional and partly something else. "Can I ask you something off the record?" Cho said. Harold nodded. "How did you know what you were looking at? When you went into that office, most people wouldn't know a falsified eviction code from a legitimate one." Harold was quiet for a moment. "I've been reading this building's paperwork for 11 years, he said. "Maintenance logs, inspection reports, tenant communications. When something doesn't match, it doesn't match. You can feel it." He paused. "Same as a bad weld. You know something's wrong before you can explain exactly why." Cho looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Bennett," he said, "I want you to know something. Councilman Thibodeau has been connected to at least 4 other building sales in this district in the last 6 years. 3 of those buildings were demolished. The residents were scattered. The story died." He paused. "Because there was no documentation. No one inside who knew where to look." Harold said nothing. "You're the first one," Cho said quietly. "In 6 years. The first person on the inside who caught it." The lobby had grown louder while they talked. More residents had come down. Frank Torres had been efficient with his door knocking. Someone Harold didn't see who had brought a folding table from the second-floor community room and set it up, and 2 women Harold recognized from the 4th floor had appeared with a coffee maker and a stack of cups. The lobby of Riverside Towers, which was normally a place people passed through without stopping, had become something else. It had become a room where people were talking to each other. Harold noticed it from the side, the way you notice things that are so different from ordinary that they take a moment to look real. Mrs. Dawson was sitting with Jessica Park's toddler on her knee. The child perfectly content Jessica, standing nearby with a cup of coffee, and a look on her face that was starting to move from frightened toward something more like determined. Frank Torres had found a man Harold knew vaguely as a retired teacher from the 6th floor, and the two of them were deep in conversation over Rachel's document folder. Neither of them attorneys. Both of them apparently deciding that wasn't going to stop them from understanding it. Vince appeared beside Harold. "You see this," Vince said quietly. "I see it," Harold said. "This happened because of you." "This happened because people needed it to happen," Harold said. "I just opened a door." Vince was quiet. Then he said, "Bobby Ray just told me something." Harold looked at him. "3 of the men outside," Vince said. "Veterans. They asked if there was anything structural in the building that needed work. Apparently there's a heating unit on 6 that's been running at 60% capacity since September," Harold said. 3 apartment doors on the 9th floor with broken lock mechanisms that Pratt wouldn't approve the parts budget for. 2nd floor laundry room has a water pressure issue that I've been managing manually for 2 months. Vince stared at him. "You've been doing this by yourself," he said. "It's my building," Harold said simply. Vince turned toward the front door. He pushed it open and said something to the men outside. Harold couldn't hear the words, but he saw the response, a ripple of movement through the crowd, a brief conversation between Vince and Bobby Ray, a nod. 5 minutes later, 3 men came inside with toolboxes. They looked at Harold. "Where do you need us first?" the one in front said. Harold looked at the 3 of them. Leather jackets, road-worn hands, the kind of competent physical ease of men who understood how to work. "6th floor," Harold said. "I'll take you up." What happened next in Riverside Towers over the following hours was the kind of thing Harold would have trouble explaining later when people asked him about it, because it unfolded so organically that there was no single moment he could point to and say, this was when everything changed. It was more like a tide coming in slow at first, then suddenly all at once, and then you couldn't remember what the dry sand had looked like. By noon, a rotating crew of bikers had repaired all 3 lock mechanisms on the 9th floor. The heating unit on 6 had been assessed diagnosed, and a part had been sourced from a hardware store 2 miles away. Paid for out of someone's pocket, no questions asked. The laundry room water pressure issue had been fixed completely in 40 minutes by a man named Dale, who turned out to have been a licensed plumber in Kentucky for 15 years before a DUI conviction had complicated things. Residents who had pressed themselves against the walls of the lobby that morning when the bikers entered were now handing them coffee. Mrs. Dawson had produced a plate of oatmeal cookies that disappeared in approximately 9 minutes. Tommy from the 4th floor had attached himself to Bobby Ray with the complete and unself-conscious certainty of a 9-year-old who had decided this large scarred man was the most interesting person he had ever met. Bobby Ray, for his part, was answering every question Tommy asked with patient, complete seriousness, which Harold suspected was making Tommy's day. At 1:15, Rachel appeared at Harold's shoulder. Her expression had shifted. "What is it?" Harold said immediately. "Pratt just hired an attorney," she said. "He's countering the injunction. His argument is that the evictions were procedurally valid and that the building sale is a legitimate commercial transaction." Harold felt something tighten in his chest. "Can he win that?" Harold said. "On the evictions, num. The false violation codes are documented, and I have your work order logs to prove it. On the building sale." She paused. "That's more complicated. The sale itself may be technically legal, even if the eviction process that facilitated it was corrupt. Thibodeau's involvement is the key. If we can prove the councilman used his planning board position to expedite the permit in exchange for compensation, the entire transaction unravels. What do you need? The handwritten account number you photographed. The transactions going back 16 months. I need a forensic accountant to trace those transfers." She paused. "That takes time we may not have." Harold was already thinking. "Vince," he called across the lobby. Vince looked up from a conversation with 2 of his men. Harold waved him over. He explained the situation in 4 sentences. Vince listened. Then he said, How long does a forensic accountant typically take? Days usually, Rachel said. Sometimes a week. What if they had all the account information pre-organized? Vince said, and the transactions already flagged by category. Rachel looked at him. Are you telling me you have someone? My chapter has a member who spent 12 years as a forensic auditor for the IRS before he... Vince stopped. Before his life got complicated. He's been doing private work for 10 years. He's very fast and he's very good. And he is about 200 feet from this building right now sitting on a motorcycle. Rachel stared at him. Then she said, "Get him." The man's name was Philip Reyes. He was 57 years old, compact and quiet with reading glasses on a chain around his neck, and the deliberate, unhurried manner of someone who had learned that accuracy was more important than speed, though he was also, as it turned out, quite fast. Harold handed him the photographs from his phone. Philip looked at them through his glasses one by one, without expression. 16 months of transfers, he said. Yes, Harold said. To an account in the name of a holding company. That's what it appears to be. Philip looked up from the phone. That holding company, he said carefully. Is it possible its registered agent is a man named Thomas Vickers? Harold looked at him. I don't know that name. Philip looked at Rachel. Thomas Vickers, he said, is Ray Thibodeau's brother-in-law. The lobby went very quiet in their immediate vicinity. Rachel's face did something that was not quite an expression, more like a controlled version of the expression she was not allowing herself to have. You recognize the account, she said. I recognize the format, Philip said. I've seen this structure before. This is not the first time this account has been used this way. He paused. I know exactly what this is, and I can document it in 6 hours. Rachel pressed her pen flat against her legal pad. Do it, she said. Philip Reyes sat down at the folding table in the lobby of Riverside Towers, borrowed a laptop from Daniel Cho, who was still there, and apparently had decided he was staying, and began to work with a quiet, methodical focus that reminded Harold of no one so much as himself. Harold watched him for a moment. Then he went and refilled his coffee. At 3 p.m, Harold's phone rang again. He looked at the screen. The number was one he hadn't seen in a very long time. His hands went still. He walked away from the lobby into the hallway beside the stairwell and answered it. Dad? Marcus. Harold leaned against the wall. Marcus, he said. A pause, the sound of breath. I saw it on the news. They're running it on the regional broadcast. There's a reporter doing a live segment outside your building. Another pause. Dad, there are 1,000 motorcycles on your street. About 1,800, Harold said. Dad? Marcus's voice cracked slightly. Not a lot. Enough. What is happening? Harold looked at the ceiling. It's a long story, he said. Are you safe? Yes. Dad, Marcus stopped, took a breath. I should have called, a long time ago. I should have... Marcus, Harold said quietly. Let's talk about that when there's more time. Right now I've got some things to finish. He paused. But I'm glad you called, son. I'm really glad. A long silence. I'm getting in the car, Marcus said. You don't have to. I'm getting in the car, Dad. Harold pressed his lips together. Drive carefully, he said. The street's going to be a little busy when you get here. He hung up. He stood in the hallway for a moment with his hand flat against the wall. 11 years of silence from a number he had never deleted from his phone. He breathed through it. Then he straightened his collar, picked up his coffee, and walked back into the lobby. Vince caught his eye from across the room. Something in Harold's face must have shown enough that Vince tilted his head slightly a question, without words. Harold gave a small shake of his head that meant later. Vince nodded and looked away, which was exactly the right response, and Harold felt again that strange recognition. The sense that this man understood something about the particular dignities of other people's private moments that most people never learned. At 5:47, Philip Reyes took off his reading glasses and set them on the table and looked at Rachel. "Done," he said. Rachel picked up the pages he'd printed from Cho's laptop. She read through them. Everyone in the lobby had gone quiet without quite deciding to. Something in Philip's tone had reached them the way a drop in temperature reaches a room. You feel it before you consciously register it. Rachel set the pages down. She looked at Harold. "Councilman Ray Thibodeau," she said, "received $214,000 in payments through the Thomas Vickers holding account over 16 months. All of them timed to specific planning board decisions related to this building." She paused. "Philip has also cross-referenced 4 additional building permits Thibodeau approved in the last 6 years to the same account structure." Frank Torres said, "Jesus." The young mother, Jessica Park, said, "What does that mean?" Rachel looked at her. "It means," she said, "that this is no longer a building dispute. This is a federal corruption case. And the evidence to support it was documented by your janitor on a 10-year-old phone in a filing cabinet this week." Every face in the lobby turned to Harold. Harold stood beside the folding table with his coffee in his hand and the same patient, neutral face he had worn for 11 years of being invisible in this building. But it felt different now. It felt like a face people were actually looking at. Mrs. Dawson said softly from her chair, "Harold?" He looked at her. "I have lived in this building for 9 years," she said, "and I want you to know I see you. I always saw you." She paused. "I just didn't know you needed me to say so." Harold looked at the floor. He pressed his lips together very tightly. The lobby was absolutely quiet. Then, from outside, from the street where 1,800 men sat in the cold on their motorcycles, waiting for what they weren't entirely sure, just that they would wait, as long as it took, a sound started. Slow at first, rhythmic. It took Harold a moment to understand what it was. Engines, not starting, not revving, just running. A low, steady collective rumble. Not aggressive, not threatening, the sound of 1,000 machines, saying together quietly, "We are still here, we are not going anywhere, and we are waiting." Harold walked to the window and looked out at the street. He looked at all of them. Then he looked back at the people in the lobby, his people, his building, the ones who hadn't left and the ones who'd been pushed out, and the ones who were going to stand up now with a retired IRS auditor's documentation and a corruption lawyer's injunction and 11 years of work order logs, and he said, "Let's get to work." The federal case against Ray Thibodeau moved faster than anyone expected. That was the first thing Harold learned about corruption, that once the documentation existed, once the paper trail was real and organized and in the hands of someone who knew how to use it, the structure that had seemed immovable suddenly moved very quickly. Like a dam that looks solid until the moment it doesn't. Philip Reyes's 6-hour analysis became the centerpiece of a federal complaint filed jointly by Rachel Okafor and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Ohio. Daniel Cho's story ran in the Plain Dealer the following morning under a headline that Harold read 3 times before he fully believed it was about his building. It was picked up by the Associated Press by noon. By the following evening, it had appeared in 47 newspapers across the country. Harold knew this because Vince told him, reading from his phone in the basement room while Harold ate his soup and tried to understand what it meant that the quiet alley behind a Cleveland apartment building had become something people in Phoenix and Atlanta and Portland were reading about over their morning coffee. 47, Harold said. 47 as of 6 o'clock, Vince said. It'll be more by morning. Harold stirred his soup. Vince, he said. Yeah. Do you think this is going to hold the case? The injunction? Vince set down his phone. Philip built that financial analysis so clean that a first-year law student could argue it, he said. Thibodeau's payments are documented down to the transaction fees. The timing relative to his planning board votes is undeniable. He paused. And Rachel told me this afternoon that the U.S. Attorney's Office found 2 other building developers who made payments through the same holding account. Men who've been waiting for someone else to go first. Another pause. Harold, it's holding. Harold nodded slowly. He looked at the photographs on the wall. Dorothy, Marcus, the Niagara Falls postcard. My son called today, he said. Vince was quiet, waiting. He's driving up from Columbus, Harold said. Should be here tomorrow morning. Vince watched Harold's face carefully. How do you feel about that? He said. Harold thought about it honestly, the way he thought about everything. Scared, he said. 4 years is a long time. People change, or they don't change, and that's its own problem. He paused. But he called. After seeing it on the news, he called. And I keep thinking that counts for something. That he saw his old man on the television, and the first thing he did was get in the car. It counts for a lot, Vince said. Harold looked at him. When did you last see Elena? He said. Vince went still. It was the particular stillness of a man who carries a specific weight and has learned to carry it without letting people see how heavy it is. 3 years, 2 months, he said. Have you reached out? Since all of this, I've been thinking about it, Vince said. I keep picking up the phone and putting it back down. Why? Because what do I say? Vince's voice had dropped to something rough. Hey, you saw your father on the news with 1,000 bikers outside a Cleveland apartment building. That helped my case. You call her, Harold said, because she's 17 years old and she deserves to hear your voice, not because of what it does for your case. He paused. You know that. Vince looked at the floor. Yeah, he said quietly. I know that. Harold stood up. He set his soup down and walked to the counter and poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of Vince. Call her tonight, he said. Whatever happens, whatever she says, call her. Don't let another day be the reason. Vince wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. He stared into it for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone. Harold went into the boiler room and closed the door behind him. He sat on the old stool beside the heating unit and listened to it hum, and gave Vince whatever privacy a concrete basement could offer, which wasn't much, but was the best he had. He sat there for 22 minutes. When Vince knocked on the doorframe, Harold came back through. Vince was sitting on the edge of the cot. He was not crying. He was. Harold had come to understand a man who had trained himself very thoroughly against crying in front of others. But his eyes were red at the corners, and his jaw was working in the way it did when he was fighting something back. Harold sat in his chair. He said nothing. Vince said, "She answered." Harold said nothing. She said, Vince stopped, cleared his throat. She said she'd been following the story, on her phone, since last night. He stopped again. She said her teacher showed it to the class, that her father was the biker in the news. She said, He pressed his lips together hard. Harold waited. She said she was proud of me, Vince said. For the first time in... He stopped completely. Harold looked at the wall. He gave it a moment. Then he said, That's a good start, Vince. Vince exhaled slowly through his nose. Yeah, he said. Yeah, it is. Marcus arrived the next morning at 9:47. Harold knew it was him before he appeared at the basement door because he heard the footsteps on the stairs, a particular rhythm slightly favoring the right leg that he recognized the way you recognize something that is written into you at a level deeper than memory. The door opened. Marcus Bennett was 44 years old and looked like a version of Harold from 30 years ago, the same height, the same broad forehead, Dorothy's eyes in Harold's face. He was wearing a coat Harold didn't recognize and carrying a coffee from a gas station somewhere on the highway, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at his father sitting in the same wooden chair beside the same boiler pipes, and his face did several things at once that Harold didn't have names for all of them. Dad, he said. Marcus, Harold said. A silence. Harold stood up. Marcus crossed the room in 3 steps and put his arms around his father, and Harold stood very still for a moment. Surprised though he shouldn't have been by the physical reality of it after 4 years, and then put his arms around his son and held on. Neither of them said anything for a while. When Marcus pulled back, his eyes were wet. He didn't try to hide it, which told Harold something important about the 4 years that whatever had happened in them had stripped away some of the pride that used to make Marcus hold himself stiff. "I'm sorry," Marcus said. "I should have." "You're here now," Harold said. "Dad, I watched you on the news, and I couldn't—" He stopped. "I thought about Mom. I thought about what she would have said to me. About 4 years." He pressed his mouth shut for a moment. She would have had some things to say. "She would have had a great many things to say," Harold said, loudly. Marcus almost laughed. It broke halfway and came out as something else, but it was close enough. He looked around the basement room. The cot, the hot plate, the radio, the photographs. "You've been living like this," he said. "I've been living well," Harold said. "Dad, I mean it, Marcus. This is my room. I know every crack in these walls. It's been mine." He paused. "Now sit down. I'll make you coffee, and you can tell me everything you should have told me 2 years ago." Marcus sat. He told him. Harold listened the way he listened to everything all the way through, without interrupting, without rushing. It was a painful story. Divorce depression, a period Marcus described as going somewhere very dark and not knowing how to find the way out, and at the bottom of it, a shame about his father that he'd turned into distance because distance was easier than admission. The usual human mathematics of avoiding the person who most needed to see you fail. Harold listened to all of it. When it was done, Harold said, "Your mother used to say that the only mistake that can't be fixed is the one you make after you already know better." Marcus was quiet. "You came," Harold said. "That's you knowing better." Marcus rubbed his face. "There's a man upstairs," Harold said, "who told me something a few days ago that I think applies here." He paused. "He said that some people spend years not knowing the road back. And I told him you don't look for the road. You just take one step in a direction that feels less wrong, and then another." Marcus looked at his father. "What happened here, Dad?" he said. "All of this. How did this start?" Harold picked up his coffee. "A man was cold," he said. "And I had a door." 3 weeks later, Dennis Pratt was arrested on 4 counts of fraud and 2 counts of filing false public records. He was arraigned on a Tuesday morning and released on bail, and the photograph of him walking out of the courthouse, head down, collar up, the expression of a man who had spent 16 months believing he was invisible to the people beneath him, ran on the front page of the Plain Dealer, alongside a photograph of Harold Bennett shaking hands with Rachel Okafor on the steps of Riverside Towers. Ray Thibodeau resigned from the city council the same afternoon. He did not make a statement. His office issued a 2-sentence press release that said nothing. By evening, federal investigators had confirmed they were pursuing a broader corruption inquiry into his 9 years on the planning board. Carol Hutchins came home on a Thursday. Harold was in the lobby when she walked through the door, her sister carrying 2 bags behind her, and Carol stopped when she saw Harold and put her hand over her mouth. "Harold," she said. Her voice was barely sound. Harold walked across the lobby to her. "Unit 4C is ready," he said. "I checked the heat myself this morning. The lock on the cabinet door that was sticking has been fixed." Carol took her hand away from her mouth. "You remembered about the cabinet," she said. "You mentioned it once," Harold said. 2 years ago. I put in a work order, but it kept getting pushed." He paused. "It won't be pushed anymore." Carol Hutchins, 78 years old. 9 years in this building, 3 months in a shelter on Denison Avenue, took Harold's face in both her hands and kissed him on the cheek. Harold stood very straight. "Welcome home, Mrs. Hutchins," he said. George Abrams came back the following week. Then a family from the 5th floor who had been displaced 8 months earlier and had been living in her sister's house in Parma. The restoration was not fast, and it was not simple. Rachel's work was meticulous and slow, and involved more paperwork than Harold had ever seen in one place, but it moved forward steadily, the way real things move, without the drama of a single moment, but with the accumulating weight of many small ones. The building was renovated, not by a development company, by a combination of donated labor, 12 bikers who turned out to have between them experience in plumbing, electrical, carpentry, drywall, and HVAC, and a city fund that Rachel had identified and accessed through the corruption settlement as soon as Thibodeau's case produced its first guilty plea. Harold managed the renovation work orders the way he had always managed everything in this building, systematically, completely, without asking anyone to notice. People noticed anyway. There was a community meeting on a Saturday morning 6 weeks after the street had filled with motorcycles. 43 residents came. Harold sat in the back. Rachel spoke. Frank Torres spoke. Jessica Park spoke. Holding her toddler on her hip, her voice steadier than Harold would have expected. Mrs. Dawson spoke last briefly and said only, "I think we should name it after him." Harold stood up immediately. "That's not necessary," he said. "Harold," Mrs. Dawson said. "I'm serious," Harold said. "I just did what any person ought to do." "That's exactly why," Mrs. Dawson said simply. "Because you did what any person ought to do, and nobody else did. And that means something." The vote was unanimous. Harold sat back down and stared at the floor. Frank Torres leaned over from the next chair. "You're going to have to get used to people seeing you," Frank said quietly. "I'm working on it," Harold said. The building became Bennett House in a ceremony on the first Saturday of February, a cold, bright morning that made every surface sharp and clear. A small crowd gathered on the front steps. Rachel was there. Daniel Cho was there with a photographer. The building's residents stood together in a group that was Harold noticed exactly the kind of group that forms when people have been through something together, slightly closer than strangers, not quite as loose as casual acquaintances, moving toward something they didn't have a word for yet. And the bikers came. Not all of them. Not 1,800. But enough 60-70 their bikes parked along the block in the cold, their jackets dark against the winter sky. Bobby Ray was there. Philip Reyes was there with his reading glasses on a chain. Dale the plumber was there shaking Harold's hand with a grip that communicated something words couldn't quite carry. Vince was there. He stood beside Harold as the new sign went up. Bennett House. Harold looked at it. He stood very still and looked at it for a long time. "How does it feel?" Vince said. "Strange," Harold said. "Strange, and I don't know, like something is finished." "Not finished?" Vince said. "Started." Harold looked at him. Vince had changed in the weeks since the alley. Not dramatically, he was still. Vince still carried himself like a man who had learned to take up space as a survival strategy, still had the road captain's instinct of reading a room before entering it. But something in his face had eased. Some tension that Harold had taken for personality had turned out to be armor, and enough of it had come off that the man underneath was visible in a way he hadn't been that first night in the rain. "Elena's coming next month," Vince said. Harold looked at him. "She's driving up from Dayton," Vince said. "With her mother. It's complicated still, but her mother agreed. They're coming for a weekend." Harold said, "You told me to take one step." "You told me," Vince said. "You did it." Vince looked at the sign. "I had a good example," he said. Marcus appeared at Harold's other shoulder. He had been coming up from Columbus on weekends since January. Not every weekend, but most of them, which was more than Harold had allowed himself to expect, and therefore more than enough. He still didn't fully understand the 4 years, and perhaps he never completely would, but he had stopped trying to explain it and started trying to fill the space with something better, which Harold had decided was the correct order of operations. "They want you to say something," Marcus told Harold. He nodded toward the small crowd where Rachel was looking at Harold with patient expectation. Harold looked at the crowd. He was not a man who made speeches. He had spent 74 years doing things rather than talking about them, which had served him reasonably well, and had also, he was beginning to understand, made him easy to overlook. He walked to the front of the steps. He looked at the people in front of him, his residence, his building, Rachel and her briefcase, Bobby Ray and his scar. Tommy from the fourth floor standing beside his mother, waving at Harold with the complete unself-consciousness of a child who has decided someone is important to him. Harold said, "I didn't do anything that required a great deal of courage. I just did what was in front of me. A man was cold. I had a door. That's the whole story." He paused. What happened after that, the lawyers and the documentation and the people who showed up on this street, none of that was me. That was all of you. Every person who decided that what was happening to this building was not acceptable. Every person who came when someone asked. Every person who stayed. He paused again. I spent a long time in this building being invisible. And I think what I learned from all of this is that invisible isn't always something that's done to you. Sometimes it's something you let happen. Sometimes you have to decide to be seen. He looked at the sign. I'm still learning that. But I'm learning it. He stepped back. Nobody filled the silence immediately. Then Mrs. Dawson began to applaud, and the residents followed. And then from the street, in a sound that Harold felt more than heard, low and rolling and generous, the bikers began to rev their engines. Not aggressively, not in warning, just in acknowledgement. The sound rolled up the street and bounced off the building and came back, and Harold stood on the steps of Bennett House and let it wash over him, and thought about a rainstorm and an alley and 7 words, and how impossibly far those 7 words had traveled from the moment he'd said them. That night, the first Friday night, which would become a tradition Harold could not have predicted and could not have stopped if he'd tried, 9 bikers came to the basement. They brought a case of coffee and a box of donuts and 2 folding chairs, since there was only the 1 wooden chair and the cot and the floor, and they sat in Harold's small room in a configuration that should not have worked spatially, but somehow did. They talked, not about the case, not about the building, about the things men talk about when the pressure is off and there's coffee and someone has opened a door that had been closed for a long time. About their fathers. About roads they'd taken and ones they wished they had. About children and second chances and the particular loneliness of men who have decided that being hard is the only way to stay safe. Harold listened. He asked questions. He made more coffee. He had always been good at this listening. Asking, making space for people to fill. He had done it quietly for decades in a building that hadn't known he was doing it. Now people were sitting in his room and doing it on purpose, and the effect was the same, but bigger, louder, warmer. Vince sat beside Harold and didn't say much. At one point, when the room was full of someone else's story, Vince leaned over quietly and said, "You know you changed thousands of lives." Harold stirred sugar into his coffee. He thought about Carol Hutchins in Unit 4C with her fixed cabinet door. He thought about Marcus driving up from Columbus on Saturdays. He thought about Elena in Dayton, who was coming next month. He thought about Tommy on the 4th floor, who said good evening. He thought about Dorothy's laugh, enormous and unapologetic, the kind you could hear from the next building. "Funny thing is," Harold said quietly, "you boys changed mine first." Vince looked at him. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. And in the weeks and months that followed, the basement window of Bennett House glowed yellow into the alley on Friday nights. The same alley where a dying biker had once collapsed alone in the rain. The same alley Harold had cleaned 10,000 times without anyone watching, the same alley that had started everything. Harold Bennett had not set out to save a building. He had not set out to expose corruption, or make national news, or have his name put on a sign above a door. He had set out on one freezing November night to make sure a suffering man did not die in the rain. That was all he had done. And it turned out exactly enough. Because the truth that Harold Bennett had always carried, and never needed anyone to tell him the truth that had made him pick up a stranger in a rainstorm document. A crime in the dark, stand on his steps, and look at 1,800 people without blinking, was the simplest truth there is. Kindness is not weakness. Invisibility is not safety. And sometimes the smallest room in the oldest building is the place where the most important light stays on.